Another challenge and barrier, has anybody ever heard of negotiation styles or conflict styles? Okay, so we all have a style that we come into a negotiation with. And there are really 5 styles. I don't know if this will come out here. Yeah. So over here you have like the level of assertiveness that you're placing on your own interests and needs. And down below you have cooperativeness, or your focus on the relationship. So the 5 styles are competing. You can see here where competitors basically place a high value on what they want and not a whole lot on the relationship. Like if you get what you want, that's fine, but that's really not the concern. Then you have avoiders, who are people who appear to not care about their own interests or the relationship. It really, from my perspective, has a lot more to do with the fact that most avoiders are deathly afraid of conflict, and so they don't want to engage. Then you have accommodators here, who place a very high value on the relationship and don't assert well for themselves. And so they're willing to give up what they need or they want for the sake of the relationship. Then you have compromisers, who do assert fairly effectively and care enough about the relationship, but tend to have a bit of a compromising mindset, that they're sort of willing to split the difference when they get into a difficult problem. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except that in a lot of negotiation and conflict situations, there's actually better solutions if you really work at them. The best negotiators, conflict resolvers that I know, are relentless. They don't accept that there isn't a solution, and they don't accept that the solution is a compromise. They keep working, they keep flipping a problem 10 different ways until they find the right and the best one. And then there are collaborators, and collaborators are folks who place a high value on what matters to them and a high value on the relationship. Now you might think, okay, well, we should all be collaborators. The problem is we're not all collaborators. But also collaborators have a problem, which is that they often struggle to make decisions. So I work with a lot of them, and they can problem solve till the cows come home, but nobody can say, how about we pick one of these? And so actually, in many ways, these can complement each other. There are times I really like working with competitors because they push the issue. But one of the things that it's important for you to know is that when you sit down with somebody, if they come off in a very direct manner and in a very assertive manner, it's their style. It's not necessarily just their personality. And by knowing this, people tend not to get as offended or take things personally. Or for example, if you work with an accommodator, right, that may be great that you always get what you want because the accommodator is always giving it to you, but the accommodator is not going to stay around long because eventually they're going to get really frustrated because their needs never get met. So part of the challenge when you work with folks like that is to say, hey, are you sure you're just willing to give that up? Like, I thought you said that that was important to you. What's important is to think about what your style is so that you're aware of it, and each one of these has a pro and a con to it. You know, it's great for competitors that they can assert, but they leave bodies in their wake because the relationships don't matter, right? So they often have a horrible reputation. This is your default. Like, this is what you've learned to this point in your life. A lot of it is, not to get too Freudian, but like how your family dealt with conflict and things like that, how you learned to deal with it. But you can also unlearn it. You can learn to be more assertive. The program that I created at Bay Path University, which is out where I live in Western Massachusetts, is a women's university. And the majority of the women that are in my program are accommodators. And I say that you are not going to be good at this unless you learn to assert for yourself. So we spend a lot of time with them working on being assertive and how to do it effectively. And they absolutely learn it. So, I mean, one of the challenges in negotiation is that half of the challenges that you deal with are out there. They're with people, they're with dynamics, right? The other half are in you, and you can't run from them. They're there. And so you need to understand yourself, because if you don't, the other people that you're dealing with will push your buttons, and they will take advantage of you, sadly as that may be. In most negotiations or most conflicts, there's a solution to be had that's usually better than compromise. And when people run to that, if their orientation, your mindset when you come into a negotiation matters very much, right? If everything looks like a nail, you use a hammer. If your mindset is compromised, then when you get to difficult issues, you don't roll up your sleeves, you don't get creative, you just say, let's split the difference and move on. Happens all the time. In fact, I'll give you a quick scenario. So there was a guy at Harvard, really nice guy, named Howard Rafa. He was a business school professor. He passed away this past year. But he was so convinced that most people did exactly what you said, which is they went into a negotiation and they were focused on compromise, that he set up a business that he called Post-Settlement Settlement. Is probably the least sexy name he could think of, I don't know. But what he did was he put out a shingle and he basically said, look, bring me your negotiated agreements, and if I can make them better for both of you, not just one or the other, but both of you, you'll give me 10% of what we find. He did 300 cases over a 5-year period, and in 90% of the cases, he found value for both of them, which means that most people were just rushing to compromise when there was a better solution out there. There's actually an Italian economist named Wilfredo Pareto. Seriously, I couldn't make that up. And he came up with a concept called the Pareto-Optimal Curve. And the Pareto-Optimal Curve means that in any negotiation situation, or any situation where there's value to be had, there's a maximum value. And his curve essentially sort of says that if you don't get there, you're leaving value on the table. And that's what happens in lots of negotiations, and not just about money. Because when I talk to people about salary negotiations, I say, look, you're going to talk about money, okay, and you want to understand those kinds of things, but that's not what makes everybody happy at a job. There's a whole bunch of other things that you value, and those things, if you bring them in, expand the pie and are fundamental. And when you deal with problems and challenges in your own community, there are things that people value that you're not going to get to if you just take a compromising approach. So I think it's a really big problem. And when I ask people, when I say the word negotiation, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Often it's compromise. And I try to say, look, and by the way, I don't talk about win-win, okay? Because I don't think everything can be a win-win in life. There are times when, but I do talk about mutual gain, which is that I think you can do better than just compromising. I think people can move toward that curve if they have the skills and they understand how to do it. Generational differences in negotiation are just like cultural differences, because the concept of respect is very different for a baby boomer than it is for a millennial. And you could use the same word, but you're not talking about the same thing when you start having a conversation, right? And so absolutely, and I think if you're trying to think about how do we attract people, you've got to understand what matters. And for a lot of them, there's this notion about mobility, like not wanting to be somewhere forever, that there's something exciting about shifting jobs and taking on new challenges, right? And 30 years ago, people were thinking, hey, I'm going to stay in this company for my whole life. There's a fundamental shift. And I think if you're thinking, what can we bring to the table? That's really important to know and again, it gets to what do people really value in a situation.